Ladies and gentlemen, join me welcoming Professor Robert Lawrence.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today. I am going to pick up a number of themes which have already been laid out by the previous speaker, Mr. Martuza. I'm going to start very briefly by talking about the gains from trade. In a sense, the theme that I was given to talk about is free trade versus protection. And so what I wanted to do was to lay out the principal arguments on either side of that argument. And that's what I'll do. So I'll look at some of the sources of the gains from trade and then think about what would be the best case you could actually make for trade protection. After that, I will turn more specifically to the issue of what we call trade in tasks, trade in global value chains, think about the theory of trade using value chains, and then we'll look at some of specific applications for Sri Lanka. So that's basically my agenda. I hope to get through it in about half an hour. So if you want to ask people why should there be international trade, where do the gains from trade come from, the basic idea we owe to David Ricardo relates to this principle of comparative advantage. Now, how do you explain comparative advantage? I've tried many ways with many of my students, and I found a way that worked with my 90-year-old mother. And basically, the way to explain it is to ask the question, is it a good idea for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house? Let's assume that painting is a very unpleasant activity. So who thinks Mark Zuckerberg should paint his own house? Okay, so none of you. Let me ask you another question. Is it expensive for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house? Yes, you know, time, they say, is valuable. And Mark's time is very, very valuable. But you see, there's actually something you don't know about Mark Zuckerberg. He's a very good house painter. Actually, I'm showing you a picture here of George, who's a very typical house painter. And Mark could actually paint his house just as well in half the time it would take George to paint his house. So now let me ask you, would you revise your opinion? How many of you think now, knowing about George, should Mark Zuckerberg paint his own house? We have a couple of people who believe he ought to, but you can see most people would think it's still very expensive for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house, isn't it? So that's basically a reasonable question to ask. Now, suppose I turn the question around and I ask you, should George develop his own software? Now, we don't know a lot about George, but let's assume he's kind of more or less like you or me, and think how long it would take him to develop Facebook and all those applications which can be used on Facebook. And you could imagine that could be very, very expensive for George to develop his own software. So in fact, George probably would be better off painting and then using some of his money that he earns to buy software. So that basically shows you the principles of comparative and absolute advantage. And in this example, it's clear. Who has absolute advantage? Well, it's Mark. Mark has an absolute advantage in developing software. Mark has an absolute advantage in house painting. But what we notice is there is a difference when it comes to comparative advantage. Because in fact, each of them has a comparative advantage. Mark has a comparative advantage in software development, and George has a comparative advantage in house painting. And while, you know, it's rather difficult to have absolute advantages in everything, it's not so hard to have a comparative advantage. You know, I'm a pretty bad tennis player, but I'm an even worse golfer. So at least I have a comparative advantage in playing tennis. And the same is true of countries. It's very hard to be absolutely good at everything, but comparatively, you're going to be better at some things than at others. So then the question is, how do we know where our comparative advantage lies? Should we go out and hire McKinsey in order to tell us, you know, what exactly is our comparative advantage? Well, it turns out there's an easier way to know what your comparative advantage is, and that is to think about, if your country was isolated, what would be relatively cheap and what would be relatively expensive? We've already gone through that exercise for George, for George and for Mark. What we know is that in Mark's world, it's very expensive for him to try to develop, to paint his own house. Okay, it's cheap for him to develop software, because the only thing he gives up when he develops software is the opportunity to paint his own house. Conversely, in George's world, it's very expensive for him to try to develop software, but it's cheap for him to paint to do painting. And so the general principle is, if something is very expensive in your world, what should you do? Should you export it or import it? You should import it. And that's why Mark Zuckerberg should not paint his own house, because it's very expensive for him to paint his own house, because he's given up the opportunity to develop software. That's why George shouldn't be engaged in trying to develop his own software, because it's very expensive for him to develop the software, whereas painting is much better for him to do. So the basic principle that we get is, if countries are different, as long as countries are different in autarky when they're isolated, as long as the relative prices in those countries are different, they ought to specialize in the things that are relatively cheap and sell those, and thereby buy the goods that are relatively expensive. That's the essence of why there are gains from international trade. Now, there's always the person who says, well, if this is the prescription, what you're basically telling George to do is, for his whole life he should be a house painter. And you're telling countries who have a comparative advantage in certain kinds of things like house painting that they should just keep on painting houses. And we're going to explore in a moment, so what if they could change their comparative advantage? But basically this is the essence of why we think there are gains from trade, and the gains will be greatest if we trade with countries that are most different from us. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Now suppose it turns out actually the countries aren't different. Suppose they were identical. Could they gain from international trade? Can similar countries gain from trade? And actually, the answer is they can, because there's a different kind of trade. You see, if you look at the patterns of trade between Chicago and New York, or in this case between Canada and the United States, you'll see Canada sells cars to the United States, and the United States sells cars to Canada. So why is that? Well, there are two reasons, and they both need to hold, for there to be gains from trade between similar countries. The first reason is that people like variety. You know, if you go and look at your closet, what you'll discover is all your shirts aren't the same, all your skirts aren't the same. You like a variety of things. As long as people have a taste for variety, that's one part of it. And secondly, to produce the varieties is costly. So there are economies of scale in producing varieties. Henry Ford understood this when he said, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants as long as it's black. That because Henry Ford knew that to produce the cars in those, especially in those days, in many different colors, was going to be costly. So it turns out then that because we have a taste for variety, and because the provision of variety is costly, there can be gains from trade in similar products. Americans will have a taste for Mercedes-Benzes, and Germans will have a taste for Chevrolets and Fords. And we will see that a lot of trade involves trade in similar products within the same industry, but differentiated. And so the conclusion is there are gains from trade when countries are very different, and that's typically the kind of trade we get between a developed and developing country. And there are gains from trade at similar levels of income between countries that are quite similar, because they're likely to like the same kind of things, and each can exploit the scale economies. So it seems like a no-brainer. There are going to be gains from trade. Let's just stop protecting and let the market work. Well, it turns out not so fast, because there's many things that markets are good at, but there are some times when markets don't perfectly allocate resources, when there is what we call market failure. And in essence, one classic market failure occurs when there are scale economies, but not at the level of the firm, but at the level of the market. Now, you've all been to markets. And actually, there's something very curious if you go to a market. What you'll find in a market is that people who are selling very similar kinds of products tend to congregate near each other. So these people are all selling clothing, and they're all sitting next to each other. And these people are selling hats, or food rather. It's a bad picture. And you can see they're all sitting next to each other. And it's not just in markets. It's true of cities. How many of you have been to New York? Okay, it turns out not many. Well, in New York, the collection of people and restaurants tends to be highly concentrated. So there's a place in New York which is Chinatown. And so if I asked you if we wanted to go and eat Chinese food, where would we go? The chances are we'll go to Chinatown. But say, where do we want to get Italian food? Anybody know? Not a lot of people who've been there. You'll go to Little Italy. Look, I'm sure in Colombo, you'll give me the right answers. And it turns out if you looked at Colombo, I promise you, if you wanted plumbing supplies, there's some place that you'll go to where you will find a lot of stores selling plumbing supplies. And if you want automobiles, there's another place where a lot of the car dealers are sitting next to each other. Now that's quite puzzling, isn't it? You'd think if you were selling the same product, you'd want to be as far away from your competition as possible. But in fact, what we see is people congregate next to each other when they're selling the same kind of products. So that means, since there's more intense competition sitting near one another, there must be some offsetting benefits. So I gave you the example of Chinese food. So why are all these Chinese food restaurants so close to each other? Well, just think about the mental experiment we've just gone through. One reason is the demand for Chinese food is bigger there. And that's why the firms want to be there. A second possibility is, you know, one of my favorite Chinese meals is Peking duck. Now, if you wanted to get some ducks and you were operating a restaurant in New York City, well, you'd have to call up someone in Long Island and say, come and deliver the ducks. And the person will say to you, where are you? And if you say to him, I'm in Chinatown, he says, well, that's great, because you know there are 20 restaurants in Chinatown, and I drive down there every day with my trucks. So in fact, the cost of supplies is cheaper in Chinatown because there are so many firms. And what we see when we look around the world is that there are tremendous gains from being close. And these are agglomeration economies. And in a sense, they're not ones that can be captured by any single firm, but they are captured by many firms, precisely because they're congregating close to each other. Now, why am I taking you through this whole analysis? It's because this is the essence of the infant industry argument. What we're saying is that the costs will tend to decline the more firms we have in the marketplace. Okay? So imagine this describes the world, and suppose that we're talking about semiconductors. Now suppose that in the beginning, this is what's happened to the supply of semiconductors in the world. The only semiconductors are being made in the United States. Semiconductors were invented by Bell Labs in the US, and they start to make semiconductors, and because there are a large number of firms, this is the supply of semiconductors in the world. Now let's suppose there's a second hypothetical country. We'll call it, so that's going to be the world price. Now suppose there's a second hypothetical country, we'll call this one South Korea. Okay? Now suppose South Korea's costs would be lower than the United States if it could come up to scale in that production. Okay. So in fact, the South Koreans, in a sense, have an advantage over the Americans. Just suppose they're better engineers than Americans. Now let's think about the first South Korean firm, and it's thinking about whether or not it should enter the marketplace. That firm is going to have the cost CO, and that firm is going to compare its cost to the world price. And it's going to say, hey, I'm not competitive. All right, so will Korea ever get into the semiconductor industry? No. But in fact, what we can see is that Korea has the potential to be more competitive than the US in the semiconductor industry. Now the Korean government has a brainwave, and they say, we are going to forbid people to import semiconductors into Korea. So we're going to close the Korean marketplace. So let's suppose that this is what happens, and this is the demand for semiconductors in Korea. Well, if that's the case, then the internal price in Korea is going to be PK1. Now, is this a good or a bad outcome? Well, we're now getting semiconductors produced in Korea, but there's still a problem. Because these firms are not competitive in the world market. Korea's domestic demand is too small to generate the scale economies that are required to turn it into a world-class competitor. This is an infant that is never going to grow up. Okay, but suppose I got it wrong and the demand was big enough. Suppose the demand is actually DK2. In that case, as more and more firms enter the Korean marketplace, the Koreans are going to become more and more efficient, and suddenly they're going to turn around and notice that their costs are lower than the world price. So they not only are going to be servicing the domestic market, they could service the international market. So here is a case of infant industry protection which generates a competitive industry that can ultimately be competitive in the world market. That, in a sense, is the case for trade protection. What you have to understand, though, is you need to be sure the government who protects needs to be very smart, because it needs to know that the domestic market is big enough to ultimately make the industry globally competitive. It also needs to know that there are market failures sufficient so that the private firms won't enter on their own. And when I look around and people tell me, I ask them from countries like Sri Lanka, why are you protecting your domestic industry? They say, oh, infant industry argument. And then my response is, yes, in theory, perhaps. But did you do the calculations? Did you know whether you're going to land up with an infant that's never going to grow up, which is going to be permanently protected? And, by the way, make things expensive for all the users of electronics who need semiconductors in their production? Or is this an industry in which ultimately you can become globally competitive? And if you have a small country, the chances of you generating those scale economies are not all that great. So, I am not saying that there couldn't be a case for some form of infant industry protection, but I would say the government needs to be really smart. It needs to identify whether or not ultimately it will be globally competitive. Otherwise, like Mark Zuckerberg, countries should not try to paint their own houses. Okay, I had some mathematics and so on. I guess I'll just go through this principle. We saw the pictures of global supply chains. You saw a picture of an automobile that was made in many countries. Now, suppose that the final price of the car, the one that we saw, where was it built, your car? Costa Rica. Let's suppose that at world prices, the final price of the car is $10,000. The price of parts is $8,000, and value added in the car is $2,000. So I'm just assuming this, if the whole car was produced efficiently. Now suppose the government puts a 10% tariff on cars. Okay? Well, the final price of the car is going to go up to $11,000. We know the parts that are imported into the country will still cost $8,000. So it sounds like it's not much protection. It's only a 10% tariff. But in fact, if we look at the value addition, we see now the value that could be added is now gone up from $2,000 to $3,000. This 10% tariff on the final product, combined with the ability to import parts, is the equivalent of a 50% subsidy to the assembly of cars in this country. We say this is a 50% rate of effective protection. Now, this could either be taken up by inefficient production, or it could be surplus profits to the firm. But either way, what you can see is you can't just look at the tariff rate. You have to understand the entire tariff structure, because if the firms have access to inputs at cheap prices, at world prices, then even though the tariff doesn't seem to be that high, it could actually you could be conferring huge subsidies on the firms. So here you can see some examples from Sri Lanka. And these are this is from a government webpage, but these are the products which have import tariffs. Here's processing and preserving of fruits and vegetables. You're giving them a 92.9% nominal tariff protection. But when you take into account the inputs that they get, the effective rate of protection is 523%. That's the protection you're giving to this product. bakery products, it's clear that the food products, but even if we go here, manufacture of articles of concrete, cement, concrete. So think about all the buildings that are going on in this city and in this country. It has a protection of effectively 230%. Okay, so now let me take you through one more example. Imagine, again, these are the costs to build a car, but along comes the government, and what it does is it puts on a tariff of 10% on car parts. But it doesn't put any tariff on the final product. So what's going to happen is the final price of the car has still got to be $10,000. The price of the parts has gone up to $8,800. And so what we've got left for value added is $1,200. So we haven't protected now this sector. We have actually punished it. And we have a penalty, and the penalty is equal to something like 40% negative effective rate of protection. What's the name we give to products that have to be sold at world prices? What do we call those products? Can you tell me a product that has to be sold at a world price? Gold? Gold is an example. No. The name we call them is exports. You see, exports have to be sold at world prices. So when we put tariffs on inputs, what we are doing is taxing our exports. That is the single most important idea I would like to leave you with. A tax on imports is a tax on exports. And this means that you shouldn't only look at your nominal tariff rates, you have to understand your tariff structure. And the most dangerous thing you can do if you ever want to be an exporter is to put tariffs on the inputs that the exporters have to use in exporting. Now, a lot of countries have figured this out, and that's why you have zones. Zones, in a sense, allow for duty-free inputs to come in. The only problem with the zone is you have to bring the imported inputs in to get that benefit. And if you try to use domestic inputs, you won't get the benefits. But nonetheless, that's one way people use it. So, just if we look at what's happened as a share of GDP to Sri Lanka's exports of goods and services, what you'll see was growing quite merrily until about 2000. But since 2000, as a share of GDP, it's gone down to 20%. And we can kind of ask, what has been going on here? Well, what we do know is what's happened to tariffs. And we know that these have been used to raise revenue, and you've invented kinds of tariffs. I've never even heard this word before, of a para-tariff. It's something unique, I think, to Sri Lanka, and the only part of your language I ever speak. So you see, you have this huge number of tariffs in the country. Now, and there's a lot of detail in this slide, but basically it shows how, and we saw in the earlier presentation, how you've accumulated all of these taxes on products. Now, just to show you a few more things in winding up. China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, what you'll notice is an amazing kind of correlation. The blue line is Chinese exports, and the red line is Chinese imports. And they're growing pretty rapidly before 2001. But after 2001, you see an acceleration for 5 years in both their exports and their imports. Now, just think about China joining the WTO. when China joined the WTO, the other countries did not open their markets to China. In fact, most countries were already giving China what's called most favored nation treatment. Now, the big change that happened in 2001 is China opened its market to imports. But what happened? Their exports soared. Yes, their imports grew, but you can also see how it generated increased exports. So, and in fact, there's a recent study put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they've gone into the details, and they have actually found the way in which the input tariff reductions had been associated with increased exports. Here's India. What you'll notice again is the correlation in the accelerations of their imports and their exports. Yes, they've run a bigger trade deficit, but it's again a very striking increase. This is Sri Lanka. Okay? This is the period when you increased your trade protection. Yes, your imports went down, but look at what happened to your exports. So this is why the central message, or one of the ideas that we would like to see promoted, is the notion that what you need is tariff reform. And you need to move to a system of very simple and significantly lower tariffs. We are not saying you should move there overnight in the sense, but you should have a long-run agenda in which you move to a much more simple system with significantly lower tariffs. Our suggestion is to have 3 bands, but that's arbitrary. We would take all of the products in a sense that now have high rates of protection, and we would still give them relatively higher rates of protection, but they would be significantly lower. And then the others, we would also lower to drastically simplify the system. Of course, the complaint or the argument will be made, well, where's the government supposed to get its revenue from? And the central message is tariffs are the wrong way to raise revenue. The right way to raise revenue is through broadly based taxes. The IMF is trying to reform the tax system. That, I think, is a move in the right direction. You need more income taxes. You may want to think about property taxes, but you do not want tariffs to be used primarily as a revenue-raising device. You might actually be surprised that flat tariff rates get you more money than very high tariff rates where you cut off the import supply. But nonetheless, you should not be using the tariffs for that purpose. The second point is, and why is simplification so important? Because what struck us when we work on Sri Lanka is that there is no rationale for these tariffs. They're all over the place. And in a sense, they're more accurately a history of who had political influence than they are of who is a great economic strategist. So we need to have a simple system. We need to have a simple system in order to say, unless there are exceptional circumstances, you'll get some tariff protection, but it's going to be simple. Personally, I would not be averse to saying 90% of the tariffs should be in the simple schedule, and then there may be some exceptions, but they would be clearly understood exceptions. There would be 2 kinds. One would be for the firms that are going to have a huge amount of adjustment difficulty. In a sense, for those you might say, we will move more slowly. We will use them implicitly as a safeguard. And a second group for the ones we really think have long-run growth potential. But there needs to be a credible argument made as to why, if you have opportunities in the domestic market, ultimately you could reach the scale economies that would make you globally competitive. And both of these exceptions should be very carefully monitored and to ensure that, in fact, they are meeting the goals and worthy of the exceptions. So I want to leave time for our discussion, and I'll end there. I hope I've convinced you, about the fundamental arguments for trade, and that the gains come from both specializing in the things you're different in, and in enjoying scale economies and a taste for variety. I hope I've also convinced you that there could be some case for infant industry protection, but it should be the exception, not the rule. It should be where you have a very strong and plausible argument that ultimately you could become globally competitive. And I hope that what I've convinced you of is that a tax on imports will ultimately be a tax on exports. And and that what you ought to be doing is to be reforming your tax system, trying to get simplification in order to help the political economy, and lowering the rates in order to stimulate your exports. And that ultimately is what we see in the evidence from other countries, and I firmly believe we would see in Sri Lanka if you moved in that direction. Thank you.